Thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Abdin Naser, and like Ayan said, I run a podcast called Isirka, focusing on identity, culture, and belonging in a Somali context. A lot of that started from being in this space in London Somali Week, Hargeisa International Book Fair. So I'm no stranger to this space. I grew up in this space and with a lot of you. So it's nice to be back and also meet some new faces. So tonight we'll be discussing, alongside Dr. Christina Woolner, this Love Songs in Motion, talking about Qarami music, Somali love songs. And this book that she published, which is over there for sale, is focused on her PhD research. She has a background in social anthropology. She's affiliated with Cambridge University, Northumbria, and she also is working with CADE as artistic director. So really looking forward to having this conversation with her, speaking a little bit more about Qarami, about love songs, about Hargeisa, about Somaliland. So welcome, Christina. So, Christina, just to kind of start off this conversation, could you please tell us how you ended up in Somaliland and what your original research questions were?
Yeah, okay, thank you. I can't see any of you, but I can kind of hear you when you clap. So thank you all for coming. I'm really excited to be here, and also thanks to Amina and also Ayan for putting me on the program. So for this question, there's kind of a really longer answer to this and a really specific moment that led to this specific project. The slightly longer history is, so I'm originally from Canada, and I did my undergrad at a university in my hometown, and I worked there with an organization that sponsored refugees to become students and residents in Canada. And through that organization, I got to know several Somalis and became friends with them over several years. And in my kind of interactions with them, I was always amazed by how they seemed transformed in the presence of poetry and also song. And then I did a master's in peace studies. And one project I was going to work on fell through, and then I had a long conversation with one of my Somali friends over Christmas when I had to kind of replan my project, and I ended up writing a paper on Somali poetry and its kind of peace-building potential. That was all just kind of desk-based research. I interviewed a few Somalis who were in North America, but that was kind of my initial entry into my initial encounter with Somalis and some of the early relationships that I had. After I finished that peace studies degree, I was kind of in between things, and I saw a job advertisement for a position at the University of Hargeisa, and I ended up taking up a job teaching at the Institute for Peace and Conflict Studies. So my first introduction to Somaliland was before this project came about, and it was teaching at the university. And based on those experiences, I had planned to do a PhD that explored the kind of grassroots-led peace process in the 1990s. But then during a preliminary fieldwork trip, I had what retrospectively was a rather kind of life-changing encounter. And this happened because I was living in the guest house at the University of Hargeisa, and there were several other lecturers there. Some of them were other foreigners, but there were also some Somali diaspora returnees who were lecturing at the university. And one of them really wanted to watch Premier League football. And so he found a TV, and they put it in the living room, and they spent like half a day trying to get the antenna in the right spot on the roof so that they could watch Premier League football. Oh, then we have another picture. Anyway, so, that's fine. They watched football, and after they ended up watching football, I was sitting there with one of the other lecturers a Somali who'd come from Moscow, actually, or lived in Moscow for a long time. And we ended up on Horn Cable TV, and Horn Cable TV has a 24-hour music channel, and it was just music video after music video after music video. And I remember very distinctly one music video. It said Hogjel across the screen, and there was a man singing, wearing military fatigues and singing. And I asked the other lecturer, I said, what's he singing about? And he said, it's about love, of course. We don't sing about war anymore. And this kind of encounter struck me on several levels. So not only was the kind of juxtaposition of his attire and the subject of his song memorable, but also because I'd not really heard much music on the streets of Hargeisa. I think because I'd done this research on poetry before, I had some sense of how significant poetry was, but music seemed to be this other kind of thing. But when I asked people, I started kind of asking around about music, and when I asked people to tell me about their favorite songs, they would speak really passionately and at length about their favorite songs and their favorite singers, and they would speak in a more open and intimate way about other subject matters than in other types of encounter. So I went back to the UK, and I completely rewrote my PhD proposal, this time with kind of love songs at its center. And my initial research questions were quite open-ended. I wanted to explore what love songs do, especially in a place where speaking about love and making music are both somewhat complicated affairs. And I also proposed that I would study what I referred to as the social and political lives of love songs as an alternative way into kind of making sense of post-war issues of kind of post-war reconstruction and reconciliation. And I think I also wrote in my proposal, there's an anthropologist named Veena Das who writes about kind of paying attention to the everyday ways that people work to make the everyday inhabitable. And I think that love songs to me seemed like a place that we might be able to kind of make sense of what's happening under the surface, how people individually are making sense of their lives and also relating to others in different ways.
Okay, so like you often know with life and with research, you start off with one question, you kind of think things are going to go one way, and you end up being taken on a completely different path. So can you share a little bit more how you went from your original research questions to what we ended up reading in this book?
Yeah, okay. So the bulk of my, the first thing to say here is that I'm an anthropologist by training. So my research was ethnographic, which this is kind of a complicated term depending who you ask in what social science discipline. But ethnographic research, I think very simply, I think one of the most succinct definitions is that it refers to kind of deep hanging out. So it means living with people for extended periods of time, having everyday conversations, participating in everyday life, and yeah, just being with people and kind of fully immersed in what's going on. The bulk of the research for this book took place in 2015 and 2016 when I lived in Hargeisa for 18 months. And I went in with a pretty rough idea that I was going to just kind of follow love songs wherever love songs took me. And I started out, I think if you go 2 slides forward, yeah, there. So I started out here in the sound archives at the Hargeisa Cultural Center. Jama's sitting, I can vaguely make out Jama's sitting over there. And I arrived in Hargeisa just after they had gotten the first kind of really large donation / purchase of cassettes. So I spent the first couple of months cataloging cassettes, sticking little labels, all those tiny little labels onto the cassettes with another volunteer who you can see there, who even though he was young, well, younger than me, he had an kind of encyclopedic memory of Somali music. And so we were very slow at cataloging because he would just tell me stories about all of the songs. And so that was my initial kind of entry into how people talk about the music, a little bit of the history of the music, some of the singers, and some of the groups. If you go to the next slide. The other thing that I did early in my research was to interview a lot of artists, and you can see some of the artists that I was lucky enough to speak with during my time there. But then as I started to kind of build relationships and get to know people, I think this gathering data by sitting down and interviewing people really faded into the background. And I spent a lot of time instead in the homes of artists. I think we'll talk later. She is there. So Khadr Dahir became a good friend of mine. I also took oud lessons with Abdin Naser and Aidid, so I spent a lot of time in their homes. Hido Daura had also just opened several months before I started my fieldwork, which was very good timing for me. So I spent a lot of time there. And I also just asked people. People knew that I was doing this research, and so they would come to me and tell me stories. And eventually, over time, I developed kind of accidentally what I initially thought of as listening sessions, where I asked songs. Almost everybody brought me songs that had been significant to them in their own love life in some way or another. And so these often turned into kind of extended many-hour conversations about people's love lives. And I think people were able to talk about their love lives in ways they might otherwise not have been, because it was in this context of kind of talking about music. In the midst of my research, I remember I had a conversation with a friend of mine. I don't know if some of you know him, Ridwan Osman. And I had kind of said to him, Ridwan, I'm going here, I'm going there. I have no structure to my research. I'm spending time in like these archives, and I'm in these houses, and then and I don't like what unites these things. It's all so disparate. I can't make any sense of it. And he just looked at me and he was like, what unites them is love songs. And I was like, oh, well, yeah, you're right. And that seems really obvious in retrospect, especially since I'd gone to study love songs. But what it made me realize is that part of the power of love songs is that they work to connect a lot of otherwise disconnected spaces and people. And they kind of move between public and private spaces in interesting ways, between intimate and political spaces, and also across generations. And this actually became a key argument of the book. And this is why it's called Love Songs in Motion. So part of the main argument I make is that songs don't stand still. They're constantly moving, being storied, being sung, being voiced, being revoiced, and remembered in certain ways. And as they do this, they're connecting people and they're connecting feelings across time and across space. And this is what makes them really powerful. And all of these disparate kind of experiences also eventually became chapters. And they kind of give the book its narrative arc, which, can you go to the next slide? Oh, sorry. I forgot this one. These are just a couple other photos of all the different types of spaces that I spent time in. And
can we discuss that real quick? Or can we
yeah, sure.
Highlight, like what is happening in each place for those that don't know?
Yes.
Because I remember that.
So at the bottom right here, this is in the archives, Radio Hargeisa. And that truck is also, that was one of the first radio broadcasting trucks. It's now sitting at Radio Hargeisa. This poster down here at the bottom and the top left corner there, those are, well, the poster is for a concert by a group called Fansan, which Abdin Naser and Aidid was kind of the mentoring. And because I took oud lessons with him and I was in his house, they were also always in his house, so I got to know them and was periodically dragged on stage with them. This one in the top middle there, this is at Hido Daur. You can see Abdin Naser there on the right. This one here, this is at it's like a house. It's this one, the one on the left, that's Hure, that's Hadrawi's brother. And this was at some performance at Hido Daur. And this one here, this was at the Ministry of Information and Culture House for Artists, where they had a keyboard where people could kind of learn to play, but it was like sitting on the floor like that. And this picture, the one on the top right, this actually predates this project. This was on my very first trip to Hargeisa. I went to Berbera, and people were like, you have to go see the Ilmi Boderi's bakery. And I was like, who is Ilmi Boderi? And I took this picture. But then it didn't take me long in the archives with Habane to realize I heard about Ilmi Boderi every other day. And realized what an important figure he is for kind of Somaliland poetry, Somali poetry, but also especially for the genesis of love songs. Can you go to the next slide? Yeah, okay, so I was just going to say a little bit about the kind of narrative arc of the book. So the first chapter is called Anatomy of Love Song, and this kind of attempts to give a kind of history of love songs from starting with Ilmi Bouderi up to the present, but looking at two things in particular: the kind of what I call the voice of love, and also what type of love animates these songs. And it's called Anatomy of a Love Song because I had an encounter pretty early in the archives. I explained my research to someone, and she said in response, "Well, if you've come to study love songs, then you've come to the right place. But I'm not sure if we should call them love songs. They're more like sadistic anatomy lessons about kind of hearts bursting and backs breaking and livers exploding." So that's where so in that chapter I attempt to trace why this idea of love suffering is so prevalent and the kind of why it's often conceived in these really bodily terms. The second chapter looks at how love songs come into being as a collaboration between a poet, a lahamiste, a musician, and a singer. So one thing I find interesting about love songs compared to some other traditions is that even though love songs are the best love songs should sound from the heart and they should sound sincere. But there isn't really a tradition of singer-songwriters. So love songs are always produced collaboratively, and they always require different people to kind of think about the love experiences of others in order to be able to put them into words and then into sound and then to voice them. The third chapter looks essentially at what happens to songs and what happens to singers when they enter public circulation. And this chapter focuses specifically on Qadr Dahir and how people talk about her, how her own kind of stories about her own love life travel alongside her songs, and her songs have become kind of imbricated in each other in a really particular way. And it also recounts my relationship with her. The fourth chapter looks at private listening practices, so how people listen to love songs in private, which is how most listening happens in Hargeisa. And here I try to make sense of the way that people listen really quite intentionally and with a really keen awareness of the effect that love songs are going to have on them, and they use them really strategically, I guess, at certain points in their love lives, whether it's to communicate something to somebody that they can't say themselves, whether it's to recover from heartbreak. This is a really common one, is when people are heartbroken, they want to know that they're not alone, so they will listen to songs as an attempt to heal. Other types of listening include kind of listening to remember and to remember romance. I'm trying to think what the other examples are. But yeah, and those ones are based on the listening sessions that I described. Chapter 5 then looks at how musicians are made and the types of, both the kind of technical skill you need to develop to become a musician, but also alongside the kind of social and political sensibilities that you need to cultivate. And also, what I think I refer to it as a certain type of kind of feelingful self. So to be able to effectively convey the emotion of a love song, you can't just play the notes. And that chapter is based on my oud lessons with Abdin Naser. And then the sixth chapter looks at a little bit more head-on the politics of love songs in Somaliland. And particularly focuses on the opening and early years of Hido Dawar's operation, and trying to look at kind of how they were able to carve out a space for live music and for love songs in a really certain type of political and religious context. So yeah, that's a brief summary. And can you go one more slide forward? Because I realize the QR code, if anybody's interested, this is a QR code for a website. One of the peculiar things about writing, well, one of the impossible things about writing about music is that books don't make sounds. And the website is a partial attempt to kind of overcome some of that. And I actually think the website's a lot more fun than the book. It makes the most sense if you look at it alongside the book, but even if not, you can also just explore it. So there are every song and every poem that is mentioned in the book is on the website. And there's also some other kind of supplementary material, a couple podcast episodes, and just to kind of to connect to some of the themes of Annette's session before, you can hear people, you can hear the subjects of the book in their own voices on the website. But yeah, anyway.
No, I think the website is an amazing kind of additional resource. If you don't have access to the book, the website is also just a good place to have this information digitally. You think you did an amazing job with the book, but also with the website, being able to listen to the audio, but then also translate, have it written out in Somali, and also translate into English. Also then with supplementary information, connecting it to your research. So I'd really recommend everybody check out the book. I also really enjoyed reading the book and seeing the lyrics in there. I was able to sing out loud, even though I'm not the best Somali singer, but I will sing a Somali song. So to kind of go into the next question, this is a big question, but if you could touch on it from what you've been able to experience. In reading this text, you've captured the essence of Somali's relationship to music and its complicated place in society. We're very obsessed with it, but then it's also very contentious how we deal with music, especially back home. And so one quote really struck out to me when I was reading the book, and you put this in the introduction. A young man named Idris said, "I feel repaired," he said, exhaling deeply. "I just feel, repaired." And then somebody else said, "Yes, when you get the sound of the oud and you hear those singers' voices, you feel relaxed." Huda concurred, "This music, that sound, those voices, it heals you." But then later on, when you're speaking about how you're learning the kaban and you were able to buy your first oud in Hargeisa, which also is a very interesting story, somebody said to you to keep the kaban in your car, to not be very public with it. And so even when we talked about how people relate to music, it was a very private thing. So when he told you to keep your kaban private, you wrote that while a symbol of soul-soothing Somaliness, quote unquote, the kaban seems to serve as a constant reminder of the contradictory emotions, joy, relief, shame, that music and musicians bring. So can you speak a little bit more about that?
Can you just advance the slide so we look at something more interesting? Yeah, so this is, Amina warned me what she was going to ask me, and this is the question where I'm I really don't know, I'm not sure what to say about this one. I'll just say that I think this is in many ways what inspired this project in the first place, was trying to make sense of, you have this thing that people love to talk about and are quite passionate about, but then aren't completely sure that it's something that they should be engaging in. And I think so it's a tension that prompted the research, and it's something that remained throughout, and I think is unresolved, both for individuals who would tell me long stories about how significant music had been at key moments in their lives and how it had really transformed them. And then they would say, "Oh, but it might be haram, so I'm going to try to limit. I'll only do it in this case, but it might be haram, but it's also, it helps me to deal, so maybe it's okay." The other thing I want to say, I think this is especially the case for love songs, because people have not only a complicated relationship to music, but also to speaking about love. And this isn't strictly an issue of what is haram or not. And I think this is a complicated relationship that can be seen as far back as the reaction that Ilmi Budari received. So publicly, in his time, he was kind of an outcast and ridiculed for falling in love, firstly for falling in love, and secondly for saying anything about it publicly. But he said something that resonated with other people, and in death he became a kind of love martyr who is today revered, and people take you to his bakery in Berbera. And I think love songs occupy a kind of similar space. So they're revered, but there's also this sense of, I'm not sure. I'm not sure about this. And in my discussion of Ilmi, I I don't know if people here know Jamal Gabobe, who wrote his PhD dissertation on Ilmi, which was a really helpful resource for me. And he talks about how he became this kind of uniting figure, but also he's also kind of unassimilated, and still people feel ashamed, in a sense, by the reaction that he received. In the section there, I borrow this term from another anthropologist, Michael Hertzfeldt, who talks about cultural intimacy, which he describes as a kind of intimacy that arises from the shared, and this is a quote, recognition of those aspects of cultural identity that are considered a source of kind of embarrassment, but that nevertheless provide insiders with an assurance of their common sociality. I didn't use that definition to apply to love songs because I'm not sure if it does completely make sense. So I'd be interested to hear from some of you after whether you think that is something that makes sense. But I think it does kind of get at that you can. Yeah, I think because music occupies and love songs occupy this complicated position, it kind of has this redoubling effect that it makes people also then feel again a part of something because it occupies that complicated position, if that makes any sense. So I don't think I've answered that one very well, but
no, it's okay,
you can all ask me questions after.
I think going back to the point that you were talking about, we were talking about music earlier, how it brings people together. Looking at these pictures, like I remember being, like I feel like I can hear her singing and I can hear the oud by just looking at the pictures. So I think there's still something that music and love songs in particular evoke so much emotion that maybe it still does the job. But I don't want to speak for your research by any means. So kind of building off of that, I'd like to go, there's one chapter about Hadrat Tahir Ege, and then another chapter that you wrote about your relationship with Abdin Naser and Aidi. So let's start off, building off of how you talked about Ilmi, let's start off with your relationship with Hadra. Could you share a little bit more about how that relationship in particular impacted your understanding and the weight of Qarami music and Somali, and how Somali people relate to Qarami?
Okay, I think we just go. Yeah, that's all right. Okay. So I think I mentioned earlier that I was introduced to Khadra by Abdi Qais. Actually, I interviewed him early on, and he was like, "Oh, you must come with me." And I went and visited her, and for reasons I still don't understand, but I'm extremely grateful for, she welcomed me into her home and kind of adopted me in a sense. And so I spent many afternoons with her. And there are so many things that I could say about her, because this was alongside my relationship with Abdin Naser. These were, I think, the most formative relationships in my research. And the first thing is that I think the time I spent in Khadra's home helped me understand the figure of the artist and how people relate to singers in particular, especially singers of a certain kind of generation. So Khadra's home was a very social space, and there were constantly people coming and going, chewing, conversing, friends, family, politicians, fans, men and women. And the way that people interacted and spoke in her home was different than I witnessed in other spaces. And they were freer in a sense. And people also told me that they found a kind of relief in being in Khadra's presence. So someone told me that her house was like their mental health hospital, which is also something people said of Hira Dawar. And a big part of this was that Khadra was an exceptionally generous and warm-hearted person, known for her qalbi furan. But it also had to do, I think, with the fact that she was a singer and that she had publicly kind of dared to bear her own love-suffering to the world. And this was known not only in her songs, but also to the fact that people knew stories about her personal love journey and relationship with Ahmed Ali Igal, who you can go and see on Sunday. But I think that this made her, I would say I've never met him, but he's now this kind of mythic figure in my head because I've heard stories, so many stories. This made her a kind of safe space, I think, where people, including me, could let down their guard and just kind of be in a different way. And somebody in another context told me that artists have a kind of flexible, he uses the term flexible culture, and they exist in this kind of liminal space and are allowed to behave and speak in ways that the general population can't. And I think this is also something that love songs do. They allow people to speak and interact in ways that other people can't otherwise. So I think Khadra was in many ways an embodiment of this. Can you go to the next slide? Yeah, and once when I asked, I'll say that she also took on this embodiment in a way, and one time I asked her to define ala'al, and she just said this to me, wa'aniga. So the second thing I'll mention, I wonder if we have time. Okay. I think I'll mention this one because I think this is quite significant. This is actually in the conclusion of the book. So the second thing, I had a quite memorable encounter with her that I think made me question how I was understanding love and love suffering. And I tell this story in the conclusion. So one day we were having a conversation, the same conversation where she told me that she was ala'al. And I asked her what ala'al feels like. And she just looked at me like completely confused. And she's like, haven't you ever been in love? And I was like, well, yeah, but I don't think I know what ala'al feels like. And I was like, well, sometimes, I don't know, I miss my partner, I get an ache. And she's like, it's like that times 1,000. And then she very, very concerned for my well-being, said, Christina, I hope that you can know this suffering. And I went away really perplexed for quite a long time, going why would she, aren't love songs all, there are so many of them seem to be about love pain, and seem to be about this desire for love to be otherwise. Why are you wishing suffering on me? And I think in time I came to realize two things. The first is maybe an obvious one, that suffering and love to her are kind of one and the same. So she was wishing upon me a really particular type of love, a kind of heart-bursting, transformative kind of love that, despite the pain it might cause, was ultimately kind of redemptive and fundamental to the experience of being human. But I also think she was wishing me to share in something and to know love suffering in a way that she had known it, and in sharing to feel less alone. And then to get back to your original question, I think this same desire is also at the heart of love songs. So they're ultimately about a desire to share difficult feelings and to be understood on the basis of shared vulnerability. So,
thank you. I was going to ask you to share that. I'm glad you shared that. And how do you feel about that now personally, even that conversation, all these years later?
Yeah, I think it's one I return to often, and I think in the conclusion of the book, I wrestle with it quite a bit. Also, it caused kind of, as a researcher, some kind of existential angst. How can I, if I don't know the feeling that is at the heart of these things, what can I say about this topic? Which is, I think, partly how I come back to this. Okay, I think it is about a desire to want to share something. And I think you go through different, and I'm still not, I don't think, it gets to a very kind of deep philosophical question about what can we ever know about somebody else's experience, and what can we, and if we can't ever be in another person's body, we can't ever experience something about them, but there is something that can happen in between us, regardless of the fact that we are different beings. And I think that love songs also bridge that gap in a particular way. But it's still, I haven't completely made sense of it. Yeah.
All right, thank you. So before we get to talking a little bit more about your relationship with Abdin Naser and Aidid, I'd like to share with the audience a couple excerpts from the book that have to do with your Oud learning journey, because that's how your relationship with him originally formed. So kind of going back to that quote that I shared a part of it earlier, but so when Christina finally bought a kaban, or bought a oud rather in Hargeisa, or bought the kaban, the person who, it was kind of like in a dark alleyway, and it was like kind of, a sketchy deal type of situation. And the person that she was buying it from told her that she already attracts enough attention. It's better for all of us, as in the artists, not to provoke anyone. Promise, please, that you'll always carry your kaban in the car. And you used to keep it in your trunk, right? And drive, yeah.
But I lived very close to Abdin Naser, so I could have walked. That was what they said.
Yeah.
Put it in your car anyway.
So you couldn't be seen outside in broad daylight. And while a symbol of soul-soothing Somaliness, the kaban seemed to serve as a constant reminder of the contradictory emotions, joy, relief, shame that music and musicians bring. So later on, you also write, when you were you write, lesson number 1 of what it means to become a musician, a lesson I was reminded of every time I put my kaban in the car instead of on my back. Pursuing one's artistic passions comes at a price. Making art means accepting a life on the edges, a life of social trade-offs. Only those who, quote-unquote, sing because they need to sing, who, like Ilmi, that you spoke about earlier, are compelled by a kind of inescapable longing to outwardly express their inner sentiments, are likely to persevere. So could you speak a little bit more on that experience of learning the oud and kind of embodying the music? Like, as you spoke about that with Khadra too, like in Khadra's chapter.
Yeah, okay. So I'll say, like with Khadra, I think my relationship with Abdin Naser was really quite a formative part of my research. Our relationship was a bit different because he was, in the first instance, my teacher. He was also a man, and I'm a woman, and that obviously impacted the dynamics of our relationship. But he did also become a friend, and I'm incredibly grateful also for the generosity that he showed me. I want to say 2 things about how our relationship shaped my understanding of Somali music. The first is that it illuminated in very concrete terms, as that quote kind of suggests, the complicated position that musicians, and especially instrumentalists, occupy. And through our lessons, I came to appreciate that sounding songs, this is the second one, isn't only a technical process, but also one that requires learning certain kind of political sensibilities and ways of feeling. So, to the first point, I can't really see you, but how many people here know, can you advance the slide, sorry? Yeah, how many people know Abdin Naser? Okay, I'll just say maybe a decent number of people. Okay, I'll just say, so Abdin Naser was really kind of revered and celebrated as a Kabaniste, also as an S&M veteran, but on a day-to-day level, he faced constant obstacles. In the time that I knew him, he moved houses 6 times, often because neighbors didn't like living next to a musician, and being a musician certainly did not make him wealthy. And he was a kind of embodiment, and this is a saying he told me, that Fananku wa ubah kudafa kadeh bahai. I probably butchered the pronunciation of that.
Do you want to say it again? Okay, Funku wa, listen, I'm not down sure. Let's just leave that one for you.
Did you understand what I said? Fananku wa ubah kudafa kadeh bahai. So like, yes.
I didn't expect that.
You didn't expect that,
Yeah.
okay. So like artists are like flower, these beautiful things growing from the rubbish or kind of cast. So I think he lived an incredibly, but he also never complained. He just kind of soldiered on. And just a little bit more about his history. So he was born in Aden, came to Hargeisa in the 80s, and learned the oud quite late, kind of like Abdullahi Karshe. And then just after his musical career was started, Hargeisa was bombed. He fled into a refugee camp. He played for people in refugee camps. He played on the front lines as part of Koch da Halgan. And then when Balagu Badle was captured, he put down his kaban and he took up a gun and became part of the armed resistance. But then after that, after the war had ended, he started to make music again. And he was really one of the only musicians who was there in the 90s and in the 2000s. A lot of the other artists ended up in Europe and North America, but he was there, and I think played a really significant role in keeping music alive. But also lived extremely precariously, but never complained, just kind of kept going. So he really was a kind of embodiment of, how one can be revered, but also live on the margins. And I just put one quote up there. I asked him about the future of music in Somaliland, and this is what he said. So as long as I'm Abdin Naser, I will play this oud. I think the other thing that he taught me was that being a musician is about a lot more than being technically competent. So you also need to have a really thick skin, and you need to learn to conduct yourself in certain ways. And the other thing is that to play love songs, you need to learn to be aware of others and to feel in certain ways. So I think people remember singers, but singers can only shine when they're supported by instrumentalists who know the strengths and the weaknesses of particular singers and are able to kind of listen and respond to them in ways that allow them to perform to their best. And the kabinista also needs to learn to feel the music in a way that allows people to kind of sing and play from the heart. And this is often how people described Abdin Naser's skill to me. I never learned how to do this properly, but I think through my lessons I came to appreciate really the important role that instrumentalists, who are often, people always know the singer of songs, they often know the poet, but I think the musicians are often not named and fade a little bit into the background. But okay, I think we need to keep going. Yeah, okay. Yeah.
What's your favorite Somali love song and why?
I was waiting for that.
What's my favorite one and why? Oh, everything's filtered through so many. I will say, so like the one, I use the term semantic snowballing in the book, which is really just a complicated way of referring to the way that a single song can come to index an increasing number of things. So you might hear a song. If I say the name of a song to you, you'll probably be able to remember where you heard it or the person who told it to you. I came into these and I knew nothing. I had no references at the beginning. But as the research went on and on and on, the specific songs have come to index so many things, and I've gotten lost, like on YouTube, listening to one song to the next song to the next song. I think I would probably say, if I had to pick kind of one song, and also because it indexes so many different things, it's probably Hafun. For several reasons. Personally, because it's a Karami, and Karami are cool. Secondly, because it's one of the first songs Abdin Naser taught me on the oud. Thirdly, because it's a song that Khadra also performed, and a song I've kind of spent a long time thinking about the music and what's going on in the music, and I won't list all the other kind of things that have kind of formed around that, but yeah, that one.
So Christina's also gotten to the point where a song is not just the song. It's like 6 layers of meanings, of ways of reading.
But I think that's also, this is what I mean by love songs in motion. I could, for any one of those songs, if I said Hafun, I bet many of you could also tell me 5 memories associated with that song, and then we could build a giant kind of snowball of all the things that have become adhered to this song. But I think there was another question up in the front, if we have. Khadra and Abdin Naser both died while the book was in moving through the final stages of production, which was a really kind of interesting. Well, I don't want to say it was devastating. And it made me think really a lot about what it meant to have written their stories in the way that I had written their stories. Khadra died first, so I had a little bit more time to process that. And so there is a little reflection in the book about trying to make sense of her death and what it meant for me as a researcher who'd spent time with her, and as someone who was about to publish something with many stories about her in it. Abdin Naser died later, six months later, just when I got, it was the day before I got the proofs of the book. And it made reading, it made the proof, it made that process quite difficult. But yeah, I think ultimately it's made me really, really grateful for the time that I did have with them, and also super aware of how the kind of temporality of our research is limited, and the story I tell is a story about music in Hargeisa in this window of time, but hopefully told in a way that speaks to bigger themes and questions. So.
The book is over there for sale. Our session is done. If you have more questions for Christina, you can, yeah, she's going to be around for the next couple of days. Thank you all.